What if somebody produced this ball python right here? How much money would that generate? How much excitement would that generate? How crazy would people all over Facebook and Instagram go sharing images of this ball python if it was real? Welcome back to another video on Animals at Home. My name is Dylan Perrin. Thank you so much for joining me. It has been months since I put out a video, obviously mostly focusing on the podcast. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. I definitely recommend checking out the podcast, but let's get into today's video. For the remainder of this video, we're going to call this ball python morph the Mirage Morph. And yes, I did Photoshop it, so sorry if you thought it was real, but it is going to play an incredibly important role in today's story. A couple of weeks ago, I released episode number 90 of the podcast, and that featured my guest, Dan Liebel, and we were discussing overfeeding big snakes. Now, that conversation made me begin to contemplate morphs again. Now, if you're a regular listener of my content, you know that I do find morphs interesting. Some are very interesting to look at and very nice to look at, but they are far from my favorite part of herpetoculture. So during my conversation with Dan, we wandered into the weeds of reticulated python morphs, which from my point of view, Retic morphs are completely absurd. Now, let me explain. Absurd is probably a little bit of a harsh statement. I'm not saying that everybody who works with retics or everybody who breeds retic morphs is absurd. I'm just saying I do think that should be a very small fraction of our hobby, and it shouldn't be expanding at the rate that it currently is. Now, if you take somebody like Garrett Hartle from Reach Out Reptiles, I think he's doing a great job. He's focusing on dwarf and super dwarf animals, which means when he produces these interesting morphs, quite often they're in much smaller package. And I believe he's also working on upgrading his breeding facility to give his breeding animals more space, which is fantastic. The more leadership we can have in the big snake community, the better, and I think that's great. But you could probably think of somebody who's doing the exact opposite. In other words, breeding mainland reticulated pythons, crazy morphs, keeping them in very small enclosures. By that, I mean the breeders in small enclosures, and then producing hundreds of babies a year. That is absurd. Oh, yeah. Even if you are absolutely stoked about morphs and you love morphs, you have no issues with them, you would at least admit that there is some collateral damage with morph production, especially overproduction of animals, too many people breeding on the hunt for a new morph, and the devaluing of the wild type specimen or the wild type animal. Both of those are negatives. We're going to talk about that more in a second. That is already plagued within the ball python industry. Do we want that replicated in the reticulated python industry? Personally, I don't. Again, I think there's a difference between super dwarfs and dwarfs when you're working with smaller animals. We still don't want collateral damage there, but we certainly don't want collateral damage with big mainland reticulated pythons. And guess what? It's already starting to happen. Partly because reticulated pythons are becoming a lot more popular. Way more people own them than they used to. That's going to almost blind us to the fact that if we're not careful, reticulated pythons are going to be in the same state as ball pythons in not too long. So let's use a different example to highlight the absurdity even more. Green anacondas. You know, there's already a few albinos floating around. As far as I know, I don't think there are any other morphs of green anaconda. But do we really want people breeding green anacondas in order to produce different morphs? Again, absurd is the right word to describe that. Most people cannot keep a green anaconda. Do I know people that do a great job? Absolutely. I've had them on the podcast. It can be done. But again, it should not be more than a tiny sliver of herpetoculture. And if we start chasing morphs on the bigger side of the bigger constrictors, we're going to have collateral damage, and it doesn't make sense. You know, my biggest problem with morphs is it's very reminiscent of the video that I did on the hedonic treadmill. So if you've not watched that, I recommend going and watch that now so you have a clear understanding of what that is. But just in short, it's this process of never being satisfied with what we've done. As soon as we produce a morph, it's going to be less exciting. That dopamine spike you get from the, pairing the animals, cutting the eggs, and seeing it for the first time eventually wears off, and the only way to hit that dopamine spike again is by producing a different, more complicated, more complex morph. It's very much like a mirage. You're walking towards this crystal clear lake in the desert, and you never actually get there. There is this base level dissatisfaction that's constantly there because you're constantly chasing something bigger and better. And there's this thing that happens once somebody gets bit by the morph bug, they become extremely obsessed with it, and it's exciting, and it overshadows all those other aspects of herpetoculture which are even more important: sustainable keeping, conservation, ethical keeping, increasing the welfare standards, natural replication. There's a giant list of things that come on top of morphs, but when you get bit by the morph bug, all you can see is the morph, literally, and it blinds you from everything else, and it even blinds you from the beauty of the animal you're looking at, because now you're not even looking at the animal or the behavior of the animal, you're only looking at the color of its scales. So for example, let's return back to that Mirage Morph ball python that I created. Look how crazy this is. Think about how insane the ball python community would go. How much money would that go for? I'd be rich if I could produce that. How crazy would Facebook and Instagram go? But now let's look at a Pueblan milk snake. That is what I kind of roughly designed this Mirage Morph off of. I took a wild animal that already exists, that already has just this unbelievably insane, crazy pattern. Look at this Pueblan milk snake. That exists in nature. Why is it that it's more interesting to look at this fictional ball python than it is to look at a Pueblan milk snake? So I think there's a bit of a glitch that happens in our mind where there's the fantasy of something that doesn't exist has a lot stronger gravitational pull than something that already exists. If the Pueblan milk snake didn't exist and somebody showed you a picture of that, you would think that is amazing. You would wish that is real. But since it is real, we can't appreciate it as much. Now, this is not a video to stop or dissuade people from breeding morphs, but we do want to at least start looking at the benefits that morphs provide herpetoculture. What benefits do they provide? Because we certainly know the downsides they have. Overproduction being a big one. I was speaking with a reptile rescue on Facebook called Snake Haws, and they actually have declared to no longer accept healthy ball pythons in their rescue. Think about how crazy that is. This is a ball python or a snake rescue that no longer will accept healthy ball pythons. And the reason is because they're being completely inundated with them. They cannot keep up with them. So what's happened is we, the reptile hobby, herpetoculture, is taking advantage of a reptile rescue because they're just accepting, they've just created this giant safety net for us, and we just continue to produce these things, and we know, Snake Haws and other rescues will deal with our collateral damage. I don't really have to worry about that because there's always someone that's going to collect my mistakes. Well, in this case, this rescue, and I think rightly so, has said, we're done collecting these animals. You guys need to start figuring your stuff out and realize you're way overproducing these animals. It's ridiculous. So I think that is a perfect example of that. And they also have reticulated pythons, carpet pythons, Burmese pythons. The list goes long. They have a huge amount of big animals as well. The other thing that morph production does is it fetishizes the babies. Cut the egg, take the photo, next. There's this over-obsession with what the animal looks like fresh out of the egg and how cool the morph looks. I know some morphs fade over time. Some don't. Some look better over time. But my question is, why are we only seeing these snakes as babies? That is a tiny fraction of that animal's life. Maybe the photo is taken within the first 3 or 4 weeks of its life. This is a snake that should live 40, 50 plus years, and we are obsessed with this tiny fraction part of its life. And in a lot of cases, these animals are bought, fed quickly, bred again, so their offspring can be taken a photo of. And it becomes this endless cycle where we're just taking photos of animals that are the offspring of power-fed animals from the last generation. It doesn't make sense. Morph production removes or distracts you from the natural history of the animal. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes this leads to the industrialized style care that I always talk about in this channel. That sort of assembly style rack system where the animals are being bred for the color of their scales. And that's it. And of course, there's issues like genetic bottlenecking or genetic disorders. The rescue that I was talking about earlier, they have reticulated pythons, carpet pythons, and ball pythons, all with genetic disorders associated with the morphs that they have. And again, we're kind of abusing the rescues because they'll handle our mistakes. So I think a really important question to ask is, what benefits do morphs have for herpetoculture as a whole? Now, if you have an answer for that, put it in the comments below. We can start a conversation here. I've heard different answers. I've heard people say, well, it creates interest. People are going to be really interested in morphs. It might add more money to the reptile economy or reptile herpetoculture in general because people are breeding morphs. There are different things like that. But from my point of view, put it this way. If you are a non-reptile person, you do not give a shit about morphs. I'm sorry. I'm married to someone who just finds reptiles interesting, but she's just not into them. She could care less about morphs. Anybody that I've talked to that's not a reptile person doesn't care about morphs at all. And the reason I'm saying that is because the reason you like morphs is because you like reptiles, just like me. I like reptiles too. Nobody gets into morphs first and then reptiles second. We all have that deep interest and fascination with these incredible animals, and morphs are like a cherry on top. Like I said, I'm not trying to eradicate morphs here. I find some morphs incredibly interesting. I think it's amazing that we're able to pull out all these genetic traits over time. That's very, very cool. But I'm not a morph person first and a reptile person second, and neither are you. It's just not possible. Talk to any non-reptile person, they will not care at all what color the snake is. That's just how, we only care about it because we are already in the hobby. So I think the line of, well, it generates interest is not actually totally authentic because it doesn't bring anybody into the hobby. Everybody got started catching garter snakes, catching frogs outside. However we all got started. I've recorded over 100 podcasts, and I'll tell you, Almost all of them start with the same story: outside catching frogs and catching small snakes. That's just how it works. Morphs get added on much later.
My summers were probably spent catching reptiles.
I was not afraid of any animals, but I was
just captivated by anything natural.
From a very young age, fascinated with the natural world.
Yeah, so I've been into reptiles since I was just a little kid.
Every time I'd see a pond with Chrysemys pictobelli, the western painted turtle, that just fascinated me beyond belief.
I, from a very early age, used to just go out and catch my own reptiles.
Was a dinosaur nut, but it wasn't just dinosaurs. It was anything that had scales.
So as far back as I can remember, the very first recollection I have of reptiles in me was turning over a rock in my yard and finding a ringneck snake.
So we'd always go outside and pick up rocks and look at salamanders.
I messed with dinosaurs as a kid, and then it just branched onto other animals. Reptiles were always the favorite.
An even more important question than asking how are morphs beneficial to herpetoculture is how are morphs beneficial to the animal? We can't skip that question. That question is far more important than the first question. We can't say, oh, morphs are great because we get interested in them and it generates more cash flow and it brings more people into the hobby, if we can't say it benefits the animal. What we do in herpetoculture really at the end of the day has to have the animal's welfare within herpetoculture as well as their wild counterparts on the planet. That needs to be priority number one. We can't skip over that and go, well, it's pretty interesting that they have these morphs, so it's going to generate more interest for us. Maybe you can draw some logic there by saying morphs allow people to be more fascinated with reptiles, which then can somehow relate to conservation. You can let me know if you have some logic there that makes sense. Put it in the comments below. I can't think of it because, like I said, we're all reptile people first. Morphs don't typically bring people into the hobby. They're already animal lovers first. I'm sure there are outliers. You can let me know. And I'm going to repeat myself again. This video is not to abolish morph creation and stop morph production. There is a pretty thin line between a locality and a morph. A natural occurring locality like a Hog Island boa, for example, that has pales, oranges, and pinks, doesn't look anything like a Colombian boa. That is essentially a morph or a color and pattern that appeared through natural selection. I believe that would happen through captivity anyway. We're going to produce lines that have lightly colored animals and darkly colored animals. It's just going to be part of the process of, breeding generations of animals. So I'm not saying we need to stop that in general, but I think we do want to be careful that that can't be our driving force. That has to be just a byproduct of captive breeding. It can't be the main focus because, again, going back to the reticulated python and the green anaconda examples, it can get absurd very, very quickly. I want to finish off by getting you guys involved here because I think we can have a little bit of fun with this. So I'm going to take you back to this Mirage ball python, this fake ball python morph that would just blow everybody's mind, and the Pueblan milk snake. Now, that was a completely fake example that I fabricated, but there are real life examples where that is true. We can find real wild type species that are either kept commonly in the hobby or not that are analogous to morphs that are being chased in the morph market. So for example, the stormtrooper ball python, the black and white ball python, everybody thinks that's pretty cool. Well, how about a California king snake? A black and white snake already exists. So if you actually really like black and white snakes, then why not gravitate towards a black and white California king snake? I went through the same thing. Before I got my jungle carpet python, I was searching for ball python morphs that looked like a jungle carpet python until I realized, why not just get a jungle carpet python? If I want a black and yellow snake, there are already animals out there that exist that don't contribute to that morph chasing mirage effect. Golden child reticulated python. You take it out into the sun, it refracts all this light, there's all this tons of iridescence and whatnot. Well, how about you look at a Brazilian rainbow boa? It has even more iridescence and even crazier colors, oranges and different circles and whatnot. They're just amazing animals. So the point is that we're chasing morphs on the morph side and replicating animals that essentially already exist on the planet in different species. Now, how about scaleless snakes? If you're a huge fan of scaleless snakes, then I think you might enjoy frogs. I think we should just remove scaleless in general. I mean, we go back to the question of, is it actually helpful to the animal? We're going to have no answers on that one. But anyway, this is where I want your guys' help. Can you think of other examples where you can think of a morph in any species, leopard gecko, ball python, corn snake, whatever it is, and can you find an animal that is analogous in its wild type that's similar? So, snakes that have a similar pattern or similar coloration. I only came up with a couple off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are many out there. I would love to create a list. At the end of the day, I think the point of this video is, why are we more obsessed with the man-made creation than the animals that already exist naturally on the planet? I think it is a glitch in our brain somewhere where we're constantly hunting and chasing for new things, and I think the morph market sort of takes advantage of that, and it sort of gets carried away on its own. So I think we can actually solve this over-obsession with morphs and transfer that more to an obsession with species diversity within herpetoculture. There are many species out there that are under threat, deforestation, habitat loss, etc., that we can bring into the hobby and establish good, clean, captive bred bloodlines, and they should satisfy some of those interesting looks that people are looking for. We can come up with a giant list, like I said in the comments, of animals that are analogous to morphs that are being chased. I think species diversity is so much more important than morph creation, and I think it might even satisfy that same feeling of getting different animals to look at. You know, if you're someone that likes morphs because you like to look at each animal and they have a very distinctive different look, well, species diversity is going to be perfect for you. There's going to be so many more things you can do with different species, and it's going to be far more interesting. So instead of chasing different colors of one species, why don't we chase different colors of different species and introduce new things to herpetoculture, which in turn will help conservation, help support the trade in a much more ethical and beneficial way for the planet in general. Again, does morph help the animal that's carrying it? Probably not. Does species diversity and bringing in new captive animals help animals in the wild? Yes, because we can protect those bloodlines, we can stop people from poaching, etc., etc. This is conversations we have on the podcast all the time. I'm not going to go through it all right now. Okay, I think that's enough. I've definitely rambled on enough at this point. I hope I made a coherent point at some point during this video. Let me know what you think. Again, this is not to attack morphs, but it is to hold a mirror up to the morph market and say, hey, are we doing the right thing here? Does this make sense? Does this make sense for the animal? And again, let's engage in a good conversation below and let me know what you guys think. I could be way off base here. Feedback is always welcome. I'll catch you guys in the next podcast and maybe video in the next couple of months. See you later.